Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to the Erickson Report. My name is Larry Erickson. I'm your host, and for the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that I hope you will find interesting. If you have any reactions to the show, send them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Now, I talked about this last time. We Americans are rather parochial in our view of the world. We tend to ignore events outside our borders unless they affect us directly. We need to realize we are not alone in this world. So this show will be all international news because, again, we are not alone. Now, one word of warning, because so much of this involves current events, some of the things I'm talking about may have changed some, perhaps even changed dramatically by the time you actually see it. So bear that in mind. I'm starting with this one because it helps to illustrate the point I'm trying to make. I learned about this from a report from Human Rights Watch. I then looked around to see what other sources I could find, and for all practical purposes, I could not find anything about it in the English language press. I found some in the Spanish language press, but my Spanish, unfortunately, is not good enough to take advantage of that. Now, I don't have a lot of subscriptions to a lot of newspapers, but I do use a couple of news scrapers. There are a couple of news sites that I can go to, and I'm rather adept at internet searches. And pretty much in doing all that, the only thing I came up with was a single link at one scraper to the same Human Rights Watch report that started the whole business. So bear that in mind as if you consider whether or not you might have thought this was, kind of nice to know. Nearly 2 years ago, in January of 2018, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued a landmark advisory ruling that recognized same-sex marriage and transgender rights and called on the nations in its jurisdiction to take steps toward marriage equality. At that time, the government of Panama signaled it would comply with the ruling. But in 2019, that same government has been looking at ways to institute constitutional changes that run directly contrary to that same ruling. Now, there are actually a number of proposals on various constitutional issues that Panama has been looking at, issues which have received preliminary support from the legislature. Some of those, in fact, involve modifying the national budget and even one to appoint a special prosecutor who could pursue charges against state attorneys that investigate legislators. Well, there were also street protests against these proposals, as well as there was one to restrict LGBTQ rights. Those became front and center, those rights, when on October 29th, legislator Jairo Bolsonaro Salazar barred a group of protesters from entering the National Assembly building, saying they are gay and they may not enter. Salazar's rant drew extra attention to the fact that one of the proposals would amend the Constitution to define marriage as between one man and one woman. Now, Panama already bars same-sex marriages under Article 26 of its Family Code, but this would write that discriminatory law into the nation's constitution, effectively barring LGBTQ folks from being full members of Panamanian society. This comes at a time of a wave of regional progress on the issue. Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Uruguay, and many Mexican states already do same-sex marriages. Costa Rica is going to start in 2020, but not Panama, not if the legislature has its way. Now, Salazar tried to walk back his homophobic remarks, but he and fellow members of his Democratic Revolutionary Party said that they had no intention of scrapping their bigoted proposal. What followed that was a week of street protests. Police responded with arbitrary detentions and excessive force, but ultimately to no avail. Because despite the police, despite Salazar, despite the legislature, the protests were too strong. The government had to stand down. On November 8th, President Laurentino Cortizo recommended that many of the constitutional amendments that were proposed should be scrapped, including the one about same-sex marriage, putting off any further discussion of constitutional amendments until the legislative session in 2020. So while this can still come up again, I would call this a win for our side. And a PS, by the way, just to give you an idea of what kind of guy Salazar is. Police were called to break up a rowdy party in Cologne in the early hours of November 10th. Police were reportedly assaulted with bottles while trying to restore order. Salazar came to the defense of one of the accused attackers. He went to local police headquarters, threatened to break the head of one of the cops, and tell them, "Take off your uniform and let's get at it." I can't say I'm surprised. All right, next, and what has to be seen as a last-ditch attempt to keep himself in power and potentially out of prison, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has appointed Naftali Bennett, leader of a small right-wing party, as defense minister. Now, it comes as the Prime Minister's Likud party announced on November 8th that Bennett's party, Hayemin Hahadish, and I desperately hope I am pronouncing that correctly, that Hayemin Hahadish is joining Likud's coalition. Hayemin Hahadish is headed by Bennett and Ayelet Shaked. Now, this move comes as a surprise because for 5 years, Bennett, a former education minister that Netanyahu fired from his cabinet, has been one of the prime minister's main political adversaries and a sharp critic, particularly on national security issues. And Shaked was justice minister until Netanyahu fired her in the wake of parliamentary elections in April. This is a purely political move arising out of Netanyahu's inability to form a government after parliamentary elections in October, the second elections this year. That meant the task has fallen to Benny Gantz, leader of the Kahol Lavan party, who has until November 18th to form a government. Remember what I said about things could have changed dramatically by the time you see this. By taking in Bennett, who had also been negotiating with Gantz in looking to extract as much benefit as he could for the 3 seats in the Knesset his party holds, but by taking in Bennett, Netanyahu still can't form a government, but he has made it significantly harder for Gantz to, and that is the point. In response, Gantz has talked about a unity government of Kahol Lavan and Likud, but one without Netanyahu and with a breakup of Likud's parliamentary coalition with a number of small right-wing and religious fundamentalist parties. Failing that, he has also talked about forming a minority government, which would mean that the coalition he formed did not have a majority of seats in the Knesset, but would be sworn in for the sake of having a government. But it's one that would have to rely on support for legislation from parties not part of that government. If Gantz fails to form a government, that would mean yet another parliamentary election, the third within a year, with Netanyahu likely again remaining as interim prime minister until then. Which raises the real reason that Netanyahu is pulling these maneuvers, and it's one that goes beyond the idea of simply staying in power. As long as he keeps others from forming a government, he can hope to stay on through round after round of parliamentary election in the hopes that Likud can at some point form a majority. Consider that following Likud's announcement about Bennett, Kahol Lavan co-leader Yair Lapid accused Netanyahu of trying to strengthen his immunity base. And there he was referring to right-wing parties such as Bennett's, many of whose leaders have declared in the past that they would support legislation that would give Netanyahu immunity from prosecution from the multiple corruption cases now facing him. A decision on whether or not to indict Netanyahu on any of those charges is due by mid-November. So he's not just looking to stay in office, he's looking to stay out of prison. All right, an ongoing dispute over maritime territory between Kenya and Somalia has sent diplomatic relations between the two countries plunging since early 2019. The disputed territory is 100,000 square kilometers, about 40,000 square miles, in the Indian Ocean, an area which offers prospects of vast oil and natural gas deposits. In other words, lots and lots of big bucks. The predictable result has been that Western countries have been lining up behind one or the other of these two, depending on which of them best serves that country's oil interests. Now, the dispute itself dates back some years, but became sharper in 2014 when Somalia sued Kenya at the International Court of Justice, asking the court to order a redrawing of the sea boundary in Somalia's favor. The hearings were scheduled to start on September 3rd, but Kenya successfully petitioned the court to put the hearings off until June of 2020. Things got even tenser in February when Kenya accused Somalia of putting Kenya's blocks up for auction during the February Somalia Oil and Gas Conference in London. Now, Somalia half rebutted Kenya's claims. It hadn't put the blocks up for sale, but it had submitted bidding rules and displayed a map of oil and gas blocks it intended to auction in the future. Following the London Oil Conference, Kenya recalled its ambassador to Somalia and asked the Somalia ambassador in Kenya to depart for consultations. In other words, get out. Meanwhile, various Western powers are choosing up sides. The UK, for example, has shown support for Somalia, both because U.S.-Kenya relations have been sour for several years and because the UK has a longer history with Somalia in terms of onshore and offshore oil exploration. Norway is also backing Somalia, perhaps partly because Somalia's prime minister is a Norwegian citizen, and partly because Kenya expelled a Norwegian oil company from the country. The U.S., on the other hand, is siding with Kenya because the two are supposedly partners in the war on terror, and the fact that the Kenya government has recently gravitated toward the United States and China as relations with the U.K. declined. And France is also on Kenya's side because the French oil company Total Oil has already contracted with Kenya in the disputed zone. Writing at The Conversation, Patrick Muthenji Maluki of the Institute for Diplomacy and International Studies at the University of Nairobi said that Kenya and Somalia need to cooperate for their mutual benefit. Unfortunately, what Kenya and Somalia may want ultimately may not depend on what they want. Burkina Faso is a landlocked country. It's a little larger than Colorado. It's in West Africa. It's also a country facing multiple challenges, many not of its own making. For one thing, it's one of the world's poorest countries, according to the UN's World Food Program. Roughly 45% of its roughly 20 million people are living on the equivalent of less than $1.25 a day. Food insecurity and undernutrition are chronic problems, with over 10% of children acutely malnourished. This threatens to get worse as climate change accelerates land degradation. Rising temperatures and increasing drought mean that in just 5 to 10 years of cultivation, the soil is no longer able to provide the mineral and water supplies for food crops, which leads to yields collapsing. 1/3 of Burkina Faso's total territory is degraded. Half of the farmland has essentially turned to sand. This in turn has led to persistent conflicts over land use and massive climate-driven migrations. Nearly 500,000 people were forced from their homes. But they're not just fleeing food insecurity, they're also fleeing physical insecurity. Over the past few years, there has been an increase in armed conflict and terrorism in the country, including an attack on a mosque in the northern town of Selmassi on October 11th that killed at least 15, and a November 6th attack on workers at a gold mine near Bangu that killed at least 47. Nearly 600 civilians have been killed in the violence and scores more wounded in recent years. As climate change increases droughts, increases land degradation, increases hunger, increases migration, increases fanaticism, increases conflict, it is to be hoped that Burkina Faso could find a way out, because we could be looking at a hint of the future. Let's take a break. And we are back. Brazil. Brazil's right-wing president, Jair Bolsonaro, is facing mounting opposition less than a year into his term. Among other causes are Brazil's teetering on the edge of recession, serious accusations of mounting violence against indigenous people, a bungled speech opening the UN General Assembly, and international condemnation of his lackadaisical attitude toward fires in the Amazon rainforest. Now he has a new problem. On November 7th, Brazil's Supreme Court overturned a 3-year-old law requiring convicted criminals to go to jail after losing their first appeal. And having to go to even as their appeals continue. The court found that law violated the country's constitutional provision that no one could be imprisoned without due process. Among those benefiting from the decision was former leftist president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known simply as Lula. He had been serving an almost 9-year sentence on corruption charges, which were seen by supporters as purely political. And that was a claim actually given credence in June by documents provided to The Intercept, which revealed that just days before filing the indictment, the chief prosecutor in the case expressed what were described as increasing doubts over the central elements of the prosecution's case, and who then worked with the chief judge in the case, one Sergio Moro, on the best way to frame the case against Lula. Moro, by the way, later became justice minister in Bolsonaro's cabinet. Those documents also showed that just 10 days before the 2018 presidential election, a Supreme Court justice granted a petition from the country's largest newspaper to interview Lula in prison, which prompted the prosecutors in his case, those who handled his case, to spend hours discussing how they could block or undermine that decision based on an explicitly expressed concern that such an interview could help Lula's party win the election. It seems hard to deny that political bias played some role in his prosecution. In the wake of that November 7th Supreme Court decision, however, Lula appealed for release from prison, and he was set free the next day. He is still convicted and could potentially wind up back in prison after appeals are exhausted, but that could take a couple of years. In the meantime, while he can't run for political office until 2025, he can participate in politics. As someone who left office in 2010 with what has been described as sky-high approval ratings because of having, among other things, pursued policies that lifted literally millions of people out of poverty, he proposes to be a real thorn in Bolsonaro's side. The day after his release, Lula, the first ever working-class president of Brazil, spoke to a rally of supporters, focusing on defeating Bolsonaro and improving the economic condition of the working class, who he accused Bolsonaro of impoverishing. As one analyst put it, Lula does not have to run for office to take center stage, making him a rallying point for a re-energized Brazilian left. Bolsonaro responded by telling reporters not to give space to compromise with a convict and calling on his own supporters to rally around his government's agenda, which included exactly the sort of severe tightening of public spending of which Lula accused him. Watch this space. All right, next up, on November 7th, New Zealand lawmakers approved a bill that commits the country to being carbon neutral by the year 2050. The measure, which passed by 119-1, demonstrates the cross-party support that climate protection has in the Pacific Island nation. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said she was grateful that over the past 10 years, Parliament had progressed from debating whether or not global warming exists to discussing what to do about it. The Zero Carbon Bill aims to provide a framework to implement climate change policies. It's in line with an international effort to hold a global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. New Zealand's bill sets an ambitious target to reduce all greenhouse gases to net zero by 2050. Now, New Zealand is well positioned to do this. It already gets 80% of its electricity from renewables, and that number will be even higher by 2035 as oil and gas are phased out. The government is shifting its fleet to electric vehicles and is working to transform other vehicles to electric. It's also restarted the program to subsidize home insulation and putting $14.5 billion over the next 10 years into transit, biking, and walking improvements. In addition, New Zealand has already committed to planting 1 billion trees by 2028. all of which is good. But when officials actually said all greenhouse gases, they didn't actually mean all. The bill creates an exemption for biogenic methane, which is emitted by plant and animal sources. That loophole is actually a big deal. Methane does not persist in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide does, decades as opposed to centuries. But it's far more potent, trapping about 30 times as much heat as carbon dioxide does. Ruminant animals, such as sheep and cattle, release methane as they digest grass and other leaves. Such animals make up 34% of New Zealand's total emission of greenhouse gases. Overall, agriculture is the largest single source of greenhouse gases in New Zealand, accounting for 48% of the total emissions. So in the case of biogenic methane, New Zealand isn't aiming for net zero, but just to reduce emissions by 24 to 47% over the next 30 years. Which means that if those targets are met, in 2050, New Zealand overall still will be emitting a quarter to over a third as much greenhouse gases as it does now, which would still be a dramatic achievement, but it ain't net zero. And it's legitimate to ask how far short of net zero we can fall before it just doesn't matter anymore. Dozens of countries have signaled a goal of net zero. Costa Rica, Denmark, Fiji, France, Germany, and the UK have all said they intend to be net zero by 2050. Sweden has gotten them one better, saying they're going to do it by 2045. Meanwhile, the world's largest greenhouse gas emitters, China, the US, and India, have not made any zero carbon commitments, although some U.S. states, including California, Washington, and New Mexico, along with a number of U.S. cities, have pledged on their own that their emissions will reach net zero. New Zealand nature advocacy organization Forest and Bird called the bill's passage an important first step, but they said that the work is far from over, which is particularly true since the main conservative opposition party in New Zealand, despite supporting the bill, nevertheless promised changes if it gains power again. The left giveth and the right taketh away. Germany, next up. Germany is celebrating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. A celebration tempered, however, by a bout of self-reflection driven by a resurgence of right-wing extremism in the country over the past few years, including, for one example, a 71% rise in violent anti-Semitic crimes in 2018 over 2017. Perhaps the clearest political example of that resurgence is the electoral rise of the far-right extremist Alternative for Germany, or AfD, party. In October's regional elections in the eastern state of Thuringia, AfD gathered 23% of the vote, including a majority of voters under age 30, and finished ahead of Angela Merkel's ruling Christian Democratic Union. AfD is stridently anti-foreigner, anti-immigrant, anti-Islam, and Eurosceptic, riding a tide of nationalist isolationism and xenophobia that actually embraces this great replacement paranoia, that paranoid notion, which is also seen in the U.S. right, that the government is trying to replace native-born citizens with refugees and foreigners. It's likely significant that AfD has seen its greatest success in the eastern part of Germany, exploiting the lingering divisions between East and West Germany. 30 years after the wall fell, 29 years after reunification, there are still significant gaps in wages, pensions, and levels of accumulated wealth between East and West, and voting patterns are considerably different. That's why a poll by the DIMAP Institute found that 52% of East Germans believe they have been unfairly treated, 64% believe the two Germanys have not completely grown back together, while an additional 15% think they haven't grown back together at all. A significant number of people in East Germany feel they have been left behind, with resulting economic stress leading to a sense of social disruption, which unhappily is easily exploited and turned into fear of the other. Some cities in Germany and some federal agencies there are facing up to this, insisting it must be opposed. The resurgence must be opposed. The question is, will they, as part of that realization, face up to their own failures which helped to create it? All right, in early October, protests erupted in Iraq, including in Baghdad and several Shiite provinces in the south, over unemployment, government corruption, and the lack of basic services such as electricity and clean water. The initial six-day wave of protests was brutally repressed, left at least 157 dead, most of them protesters shot to death in Baghdad. After a lull, protests resumed on October 24th with even greater energy. Again, they have been met with lethal violence. The death toll is now over 300. The number of injured approaches 15,000. On October 31st, in the face of protesters' demands for new elections, Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi agreed to resign, but only on the condition that a successor is named to replace him. There still hasn't been. Instead, at the end of the first week of November, competing political blocs rallied around Mahdi as populist cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, who initially sided with the protesters, switched to supporting Mahdi. The result has been an agreement to end the protests by any means necessary, according to a high government official quoted by AFP, leading to a brutal crackdown which began on November 9th as security forces cleared protest sites in Baghdad, Basra, and Kabbalah, using live ammunition, tear gas, including firing canisters directly at people and directly at their tents, and sound bombs, aka stun grenades. Among those who were targeted were medics who had volunteered to help with the wounded. Officials are now promising to move on a series of reforms, including hiring drives, welfare plans, a ramp of the electoral law, and constitutional amendments. But it remains to be seen if these new promises prove to be any less empty than the string of promises which have preceded them. Oil-rich Iraq is OPEC's second biggest producer, but according to the World Bank, 20% of its people live in poverty, youth unemployment is 25%, and it's ranked at the 12th most corrupt country in the world by Transparency International. I'll end with this because I swear that if I was doing a clown award this time, I'd have a runaway winner. New Delhi, the capital city of India, has been experiencing record levels of air pollution. How bad? Consider that on the Air Quality Index, which is an international measure used by health officials, any reading above 100 is considered unhealthy. In some areas of Delhi, the province where New Delhi is, during the first week of November, that index was well over 900. Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal said the city has been turned into a gas chamber. Not just there either. In the industrial hubbub of Kanpur, a home to 3 million people, air quality readings have been consistently above 500 for several days. There have been attempts to deal with this. Construction activities that could add to dust in the air have been halted. Schools were shut. Government advisories issued. Factories that hadn't shifted to piped natural gas were closed. And odd even driving days were instituted. But some people could not pass up the opportunity to show how clueless they are. India's Minister for Health and Family Welfare tweeted that eating carrots would help. And the Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change just said that people should start their day with music. But not to be outdone by such bureaucrats, Vineet Agarwal Sharda, a leader of India's ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, said that the pollution should not be blamed on stubble burning or industrial emissions, whatnot. No, but on Pakistan and China, either of which, he said, could have released poisonous gases into India because they are afraid of us. Yeah, well, I find you pretty scary. All right, that's it. We're out of here. We will see you in 2 weeks. Have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And for now, as always, peace.